In Memphis, Tennessee, a horrible crime terrified local residents. Most never heard the young mother's screams, but they felt the loss. As local authorities searched for the perpetrator, they found many who had motive. Investigators were forced to consider whether this was a random act of violence or a crime of deliberate calculation.
When a wealthy young woman was abducted in front of her in-laws' home, the police had no shortage of suspects. The 25-year-old victim left behind a tumultuous marriage, an ex-husband, and old boyfriends. All were on the FBI's short list. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. As suspects are interviewed, the case grew no clearer. To find the woman and her abductor, investigators would have to first determine the motive.
Tunica County, Mississippi, just south of Memphis, Tennessee, is America's third largest gambling destination. 25-year-old Shannon Sanderson had recently become one of the regulars. On April 19, 1996, the housewife from nearby Memphis, Tennessee, visited her favorite casino. Shannon was having a good night. She managed to turn $500 into $5,000 at the high-stakes blackjack table. At 3:30 a.m., she cashed out and headed home.
Sure. Can I have security? Security.
When players win big, most casinos provide a security escort to protect customers from theft. This casino was no exception. Upon Shannon's request, a guard followed her to the parking area.
Oh, it was great.
It was an hour's drive to Shannon's home in Memphis through secluded roads. She knew the route well. She loved to win, but could afford to lose. Less than a year earlier, she'd married her boss, a multi-millionaire who was 33 years her senior. Earlier that evening, she had dropped off her 3 young children from her previous marriage at the home of their grandparents in northeast Memphis. It was about 4:45 a.m. when Shannon pulled into the grandparents' driveway to pick up her children. She needed to get them off to school on time in the morning.
Did you hear that?
Inside the house, Shannon's former in-laws were awakened by a piercing scream. Her former father-in-law rushed to the window to see Shannon struggling with someone in a baseball cap. He raced to assist her. Neighbors also heard the commotion and witnessed the crime. Within seconds, the mother of 3 had been abducted less than 50 feet from the front door. The distraught grandfather called 911. Memphis police were immediately dispatched. In kidnapping cases, a quick response can mean the difference between life and death. Police arrived within minutes and interviewed Shannon's former father-in-law. Memphis police captain Richard David Wolson, a sergeant at the time, recalls that the shaken man did his best to recall what he had seen.
Her ex-father-in-law heard a commotion and observed a car driving away. At the same time, some other neighbors on the street heard the commotion and also looked out and saw a car drive away and gave a description of the driver and description of the car.
Despite the dim light, witnesses agreed that the driver had worn a red baseball cap. But their descriptions of the vehicle varied. Some described it vaguely as dark-colored and sporty.
She was by herself.
Another witness was certain that it was a maroon Chevy
She
Beretta.
dropped the kids off by herself too, so.
None of them could describe the driver's face.
It was, like I said, that was hard.
On the driveway, close to the street, police found 2 metal buttons assumed to have been torn from Shannon's clothing. Close by, they recovered a single artificial fingernail. The victim's car was searched, but police found nothing to suggest the identity of her abductor or Shannon's whereabouts. Her ex-father-in-law had seen Shannon earlier that evening when she had dropped off her children. He and his wife had agreed to babysit their grandchildren while Shannon celebrated her new husband's birthday at the casino.
You guys, what's going on? Man, it's good to see you.
Their former daughter-in-law had divorced their son less than a year before. Still, their relationship with her remained amicable, and she visited regularly with the children.
Guys, pretty good, all right?
Wasn't a real fancy car.
Shannon's former father-in-law told police the name of the casino where Shannon and her new husband liked to play. The casino confirmed she'd been there and won $5,000, but no one could say if she was with anyone in particular. Later that day, news that the mother of 3 was abducted just steps from where her children slept horrified local residents, according to Memphis District Attorney Jerry Kitchen.
She appeared to be a person who was very conscious about the upbringing of her children because she had returned back to Memphis to pick her children up to make sure that they got to school.
Memphis police questioned Shannon's ex-husband, who was the father of her 3 children.
Was anybody here with you after 11:30? No, sir. Okay. All right, yeah. No, thank you, brothers. Give me a gentleman a minute. Thanks, sweetie.
He was at work when the abduction occurred in front of his parents' home. Though his relationship with Shannon had been stormy, they remained married for almost 8 years. They finally divorced after Shannon fell in love with her present husband.
Call her in the evening.
Memphis police were reluctant to eliminate him as a suspect so early in the investigation, though Shannon's ex-husband's alibi was solid.
Who knows the reason why people get a divorce, but I've never heard of a good divorce. She still made him pay alimony, even though she was married to a wealthy person.
And join us.
Police looked to her present husband to learn more. Since he was a multimillionaire, they considered the possibility that Shannon may have been kidnapped for ransom.
He owned a large security company here in Memphis, and he was well known. Everybody wanted to help him because they knew him or knew of him. And being that he was wealthy, she would be a prime target to be kidnapped for money.
So far, he had received no ransom call or letter. He'd been distraught since being woken at 5 a.m. with the news of his wife's abduction. Regrettably, the last time they'd spoken that night, they'd had a fight.
Engaged in whatever she was doing.
Happy birthday to you.
It was his 58th birthday, and his teenage daughters from a previous marriage had stopped by to celebrate.
Happy birthday to you.
That same evening, his wife Shannon had planned to take him to the casino.
Hello?
Hi, sweetie.
After dropping off her children, she called to say that she was on the way to pick him up.
I know.
He told her he wasn't ready. His daughters were there, and he wanted to spend more time with them before going out.
Would go there tonight.
No.
Shannon became angry.
We don't get along.
According to her husband, she felt he was putting his children ahead of their plans. He told her he could be ready in a half hour, but she hung up on him.
Hello?
He expected that she'd cool down and pick him up.
What's that all about?
Oh,
But when he tried to call later, she did not answer.
She and I are just
Sit down.
I guess there's just such a difference in our age.
Police asked if he knew anyone who might want to harm Shannon.
The last thing she said to me was something.
The husband mentioned an ex-boyfriend against whom Shannon had filed charges of harassment a year earlier. He believed the ex-boyfriend drove a Chevy Beretta. At headquarters, police checked with DMV, but found no records that her ex-boyfriend or any of his family owned a Beretta. A criminal background check did confirm that a judge had ordered her ex-lover to have no contact with Shannon over the past year. Investigators went to question Shannon's ex-boyfriend, but he was not at home, nor had he shown up for work. His sister lived in the same neighborhood, a few blocks from where Shannon had been abducted. She reported that she had seen a suspicious car drive past her house on the night of the crime.
No, we haven't heard anything yet.
She was out on the porch around the time of the abduction when a maroon Chevy Beretta sped by, heading out of the neighborhood. She said she didn't recognize the driver at first.
Did you have to notice?
But when she saw a photo of Shannon's wealthy husband in a news report, she was sure it was him. Though Memphis police had first considered the possibility that Shannon had been abducted for ransom, they now began to consider another possibility.
It's always in the back of your mind due to her being married to a wealthy person and the difference in their ages that something could have happened to her to get rid of her. We just didn't know, so we tried to cover every angle that we could.
Memphis police asked Shannon's husband to provide a formal statement.
The reason I've asked you here today.
With his lawyer present, he filled in detectives about his relationship with Shannon. Police knew that he had met Shannon while she was still married, working at the security company he owned.
Here's your coffee, sir. Be careful.
She worked for him, but soon their relationship took a personal turn. Their romance led to marriage, but the magic didn't last long.
There's nothing else that you can think of.
9 months later, they began negotiating a postnuptial agreement outlining terms in the event the troubled union broke. Both had previous marriages that ended in divorce, and Shannon needed to feel certain that she would retain custody of her children. They'd filed it just 10 days before Shannon's abduction.
Feeling sufficiently well to come to.
Shannon's husband emphasized that it was his wife who wanted the agreement. He claimed money was not the issue since they kept separate bank accounts.
You do realize that by refusing.
When police asked, the husband agreed to reinforce his statement with a polygraph.
This meeting.
To cover all possibilities, police checked local morgues, jails, and hospitals. But after a week, investigators had no solid leads to Shannon's whereabouts. Police in Memphis received dozens of calls from local residents. Most were well-intentioned but unproductive.
Uh-huh. And your name again? In the morning.
All had to be checked.
Yes, ma'am, and thanks for the call.
One was from a woman named Sharon Powers in nearby Clarksdale, Mississippi, 80 miles south of Memphis.
The abduction was reported in the paper and on the news, and a description of the car was given. She had contacted the Memphis Police Department saying that she thought that maybe her husband was involved because of the description of the car.
She told Mississippi police that she believed her husband, Lee, may fit the suspect description. The day after the crime was reported, he had worn a red cap and left town in their red Chevy Beretta to see his mother. The woman said that she and her husband had been fighting. Police asked her to have him call when he returned. They weren't optimistic. Her report sounded like a possible domestic dispute unrelated to the crime. On May 3, 1996, police responded to another call from a concerned citizen trying to help. At a casino in Tunica County, Mississippi, a witness believed he had spotted Shannon Sanderson dressed as a casino employee.
May I help?
But when an officer approached her, he realized that it was a case of mistaken identity. It was one more call among hundreds of false leads that frustrated the investigation. After 2 weeks of searching, local investigators were no closer to finding the missing mother of 3. Her family was left only with the hope that she was still alive. In the spring of 1996, Memphis police continued their search for 25-year-old Shannon Sanderson, who had been abducted from the front of her former in-law's home. Investigators had questioned her wealthy husband, past lovers, and area residents, but none offered clues to her whereabouts. In any investigation, authorities try first to eliminate those people closest to the victim. After more than 2 weeks of searching, Memphis Police Captain Richard David Rolson feared that time was running out.
Due to her past boyfriends and lovers, we just didn't know what happened, but as the days went by, the chances of finding her alive were slimmer and slimmer.
On May 6th, Shannon's ex-boyfriend finally came in for questioning.
Friend of yours? No.
He had only recently completed his year-long probation of harassment charges against Shannon. He claimed to be asleep in his mother's house at the time of her abduction. According to the ex-boyfriend, he avoided Shannon as his probation required, but Shannon continued to call him, complaining that she wasn't happy with her new marriage. He added that he would have to talk to his lawyer before agreeing to take a polygraph. He remained a potential suspect. But as with Shannon's husband, no hard evidence existed to prove nor disprove his involvement. Then, on May 9th, 1996, 40 miles south from where Shannon had been abducted, sheriffs in DeSoto County, Mississippi were called to a rural plot of land in the town of Eudora. Two people had been inspecting their new property when they noticed a strong odor. Then they discovered a woman's decomposing body. The DeSoto County crime scene technicians set up a grid around the immediate area.
Item.
They conducted a line search, looking for anything that might be a clue.
Go.
They labeled and recorded every item they came across as they drew closer to the body. 15 feet away, they found a woman's high-heeled shoe.
Go.
Closer to the body, they marked the location of another. DeSoto sheriffs checked their records, but found no women reported missing locally. They broadened their search to include larger towns and cities in the region. When they contacted Memphis authorities, police there told them that a 25-year-old mother of 3 named Shannon Sanderson had been missing for more than 2 weeks. DeSoto deputies learned that she was blonde, approximately 5'5", 130 pounds, had a small tattoo, and was last seen wearing a dress, high heels, a jacket with metal buttons, and pink artificial fingernails.
Looks good so far.
That description fit the body, but they needed an autopsy to confirm her identity and cause of death. The medical examiner determined that the victim had been killed by a single .25 caliber bullet to the right temple.
And you're bagging it, right?
Yes, sir. Date and time.
The victim's clothes were removed and preserved to check for trace evidence that might lead to the killer. The body, dead an estimated 2 to 3 weeks, was too decomposed to recognize. But over her left breast, examiners found a small tattoo that was still visible. It said, "I love you, Robert." Shannon Sanderson had such a tattoo. The medical examiner compared her dental records to x-rays from the body.
Okay, definitely X-rays.
They confirmed the ID. This was Shannon Sanderson's body. The abduction was now officially a homicide. In Memphis, Assistant District Attorney Jerry Kitchen was called in. His first task would be to somehow narrow the suspect list the police had developed over the past 3 weeks.
Here in Memphis, it's somewhat unusual in that we have relatively few murder cases that we would classify as mystery homicides, where someone's not either developed as a suspect rather quickly or arrested soon after the incident. But in this particular case, it was a mystery homicide with numerous suspects that were listed as potentially being involved in the abduction and killing of the victim.
The Assistant District Attorney first called the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation to conduct polygraph examinations to help eliminate potential suspects. He also contacted the FBI, since Shannon's body was found across the Tennessee state line. Supervisory Special Agent Jennifer Aiken from the FBI's Memphis field office was assigned as case agent.
They felt they needed some additional resources. The case was a very difficult case. It crossed jurisdictions, and they wanted the FBI to be involved as part of the team working towards a solution, because it was not an easy case.
Memphis authorities hoped that Agent Aiken's experience would help unravel the complexities of this case. Local residents were fearful that Shannon's killer was still out there, not knowing if or when he would strike again. In the spring of 1996, the body of 25-year-old Shannon Sanderson, a mother of 3, was found in Eudora, Mississippi, 40 miles from her Memphis, Tennessee home. The FBI, together with state and local investigators, needed to shorten the lengthy suspect list that included Shannon's husband and past lovers. Assistant District Attorney Jerry Kitchen hoped polygraph examinations could help focus their search.
This investigation was difficult in that there were a lot of suspects in this particular case. Throughout the victim's life, she had, of course, been divorced. And naturally, in any type of murder case, you do focus in and you do look at relatives or acquaintances or husbands, any type of relationship that the victim may have been involved in that could lead back to some type of dispute or domestic violence.
Tennessee state authorities tested several of Shannon's ex-lovers. They asked them their whereabouts on the night of the abduction. They asked directly if they had abducted or killed Shannon. All denied any involvement. The tests revealed no deception. Investigators corroborated their alibis and eliminated them as potential suspects.
You intend to answer truthfully, deliberately withholding any.
They also polygraphed the witness who claimed to have seen Shannon's current husband driving a maroon Chevy Beretta in the neighborhood moments before the abduction occurred. It was the same type of vehicle other witnesses had described that Shannon was forced into. But the woman was found to be deceptive.
These are Becky's charts. Her test.
Though police now believed her claim was false, that she had seen Shannon's husband driving the getaway vehicle, they also knew that Shannon's brief marriage with her wealthy husband had been rocky. They wanted to confirm once and for all that he had not been involved in any way.
This question about honesty and what she is.
This crime occurred at 4 o'clock in the morning. The victim's husband had indicated that he went to bed and that there was no one else that he was with. And so he really had no alibi. And so that was an area that was difficult for us to get over because we could not lock down exactly where he was and what he was doing without other than what he was telling us.
Investigators contacted Shannon's husband to be polygraphed. Though he had previously agreed to do so, on advice from his lawyer, he declined. Heart medication that he was taking may have induced a false reading, according to his lawyer.
Are you feeling? Do you have any objections?
For Captain Ransom, the husband's refusal didn't alleviate the suspicions that surrounded him.
Why is that?
You couldn't understand, if he didn't have anything to do with it, why he wouldn't be wanting to cooperate. And being a homicide detective, you're suspicious, and it just made him that more suspicious.
In terms of incriminating evidence, the investigation was at a standstill. Supervisory Special Agent Jennifer Aiken hoped to refocus the investigation by examining leads that may have been overlooked.
We have to look at all of the possibilities, and that's, part of the battle in the beginning is not to get too far down the road in speculating about what kind of guy this could be, and what, what his relationship or non-relationship would be to the victim. What we did then is identify what other possibilities do we still need to explore.
One possibility, though not a promising one, was Sharon Powers, who earlier reported that her husband may have matched the vague description of the suspect.
Get some more information about it.
I don't believe he is.
But now she wasn't so sure about her previous claim. She told police she'd overreacted, reinforcing their belief that she'd only been trying to get back at her husband for leaving her.
Yeah, so it couldn't have been him.
She said that her husband had left town, that they had had some, marital disputes. They felt that perhaps this report was really just sort of sour grapes and that she was trying to get her husband, maybe estranged husband, into trouble of some kind. And so they really just simply did not know how much weight to give this rather conflicting and kind of half-hearted story that she was telling.
Though her husband wasn't a serious suspect, police wanted to talk with him. A bulletin for Gerald Lee Powers was issued that he was wanted for questioning in Tennessee. FBI agents and Tennessee investigators met to review the casino surveillance tape of the blackjack table where Shannon had won the now missing $5,000. Her growing pile of chips would certainly make her an attractive target. They viewed the tape to see if a stalker could be seen. But if that was the killer's intention, Agent Aiken questioned why he would wait so long to make his move.
Clearly, she had been winning for a while. She was there late at night. There were a number of factors that made her visit to that casino rather high risk. And yet we had this abduction occurring almost an hour to an hour and a half after she left that environment. So first we had to determine, did it have anything or nothing to do with her visit to that casino?
The tape showed Shannon, but was inadequate to reveal whether she was being stalked. Investigators were no closer to finding the truth. As they contemplated what to do next, the investigation veered in an unexpected direction. On May 22, 1996, near Hebronville, Texas, 750 miles from where Shannon was seen forced into a car described as a Chevy Beretta, a vehicle fitting that description erratically swerved away from a border checkpoint. The vehicle had Mississippi plates. One of the patrol guards raced after it, believing the driver to be a potential border jumper or smuggler. In May of 1996, as the investigation continued into the kidnapping and murder of a young Tennessee mother, U.S. Border Patrol agents chased down a fleeing maroon Chevy Beretta with Mississippi plates the type of car described by witnesses in the abduction. Caught at a dead end, the suspect resisted,
Drop it! Drop the knife! Up against the car! Up against the car!
then backed down when confronted by the agent's gun.
Give me the other hand. Give me the other hand.
He had 14 $100 bills in his pocket.
Really?
The driver said his name was Gerald Lee Powers, but held no driver's license to prove it. A cursory search of the car revealed no illegal drugs or aliens. But in the trunk, border agents recovered a stolen weapon registered in Arkansas. The car was locked and remained in that spot under armed guard until FBI agents could conduct a more thorough search. Special Agent Evan Ray from the FBI field office in Laredo, Texas, was contacted since assaulting a Border Patrol officer is a federal offense. Agent Ray confirmed the identity of the driver when he learned that Gerald Lee Powers had been involved in another altercation at the Mexican border.
I spoke to U.S. Customs Service officials who had indicated that they had had an incident that day as well, in which an individual had fled and had left several pieces of identification behind on the counter when they fled. And so we were then in possession of several pieces of identification of Mr. Powers.
A license plate check revealed that the vehicle was registered to his wife Sharon in Clarksdale, Mississippi. Agent Ray also discovered that Gerald Lee Powers had a violent past and was currently wanted for questioning in the abduction and murder of Shannon Sanderson. After contacting Memphis authorities, he traveled to Hebronville to process Powers' car on site. The Chevy Beretta matched the vehicle witnesses had described at the abduction. Agents hoped something inside would link the vehicle and Powers to the murder of Shannon Sanderson. A sheet and pillowcase, along with the trunk liner, were bundled into evidence bags.
All right, let's tape this stuff up. We'll get it back to headquarters.
When you're retrieving evidence like that, you have no idea what the results of the laboratory examinations are going to be in the end. You just try to get the best and the most evidence that you can and let the lab do their job.
Agents were less hopeful they'd find something in the car's interior since it appeared to have been recently cleaned and vacuumed. Hundreds of miles from the nearest evidence response team, Agent Ray improvised with the tools he had at hand.
One item that we needed to search for were hairs and fibers in the back seat area. We didn't have the specialized equipment that the evidence response team would have, and so I used an unopened lint roller that I had at the office of the type one might use on a suit as an adhesive lift.
Initially obscured by the front seat, the agent found a pink artificial fingernail on the floor. It was similar to those the victim had worn at the time of her abduction. Memphis prosecutor Jerry Kitchen believed this could be the clue that could definitely place Shannon Sanderson in Powers' car.
Agent Ray had called us and told us that he had found a fingernail in the back seat area of the floorboard of this vehicle, which is where we had felt that, based upon the witnesses' information they had given us, that the victim had been placed in the back seat of the vehicle that took her away.
Memphis authorities came to Laredo to question Gerald Lee Powers about the murder. Powers told them that he knew nothing more than what he'd heard on the news. He admitted to being at the casino that night, but had left early to check on his terminally ill neighbor. While the interview continued, investigators spoke to his neighbor in Clarksdale, Mississippi, who denied that Powers had been there at that time.
We weren't 100% convinced Gerald Powers was our suspect. We just felt it was kind of suspicious that he he was trying to give a false alibi, and that, of course, the neighbor was very ill and could have been mistaken because he had been there at different times.
Investigators hoped that Powers' wife, Sharon, might be able to corroborate the neighbor's statement. She had initially told police her husband fit the description of the suspect who witnesses glimpsed at the abduction. A man who wore a red baseball cap. Now she added that he made frequent trips to the casino where the victim had spent her last night. Still, she did not know if he had visited their neighbor that night, and denied that her husband had anything to do with the abduction and murder of Shannon Sanderson.
He treated you okay?
Oh, yeah.
Investigators feared they might just be wasting their time. But FBI Special Agent Jennifer Aiken wasn't so sure.
We sensed her ambivalence. We knew that she, had come forward, even with her kind of half-hearted story. We knew she'd come forward for a reason and that there was more she needed to tell.
Seconds later, Gerald Lee Powers.
Agent Aiken realized that she would need to invest a great deal of time to develop the trust of Sharon Powers.
Really, it's tremendous.
As the dialogue with Sharon Powers continued over several weeks, the FBI contacted Tom Scott, director of surveillance at the casino where the victim had gambled prior to her abduction. Scott was asked to confirm if Gerald Lee Powers had been recorded that same night on any of the 600 cameras in the 95,000 square foot casino.
Jennifer Aiken from the FBI gave us a basic description of what the suspect possibly was wearing on the night in question. And that's what we went with as a general description, from color shoes to jeans to a certain type jacket and possibly a ball cap. Any given day, you can have approximately 3,000 to 10,000 people within a casino.
Scott and his team searched hundreds of hours of footage, looking for a man in a red baseball cap and yellow shirt. Their main focus was the blackjack table where Shannon spent most of the night.
If the suspect was stationary, it's pretty easy. But in a casino, it's quite an exciting place to be in, and everybody kind of wanders around. And they go to slot machine to slot machine, or restaurants, or table games. We could not locate the individual.
Investigators looked to Sharon Powers for more detail about her husband's activities that night. They did what they could to make her feel comfortable. One of her neighbors, a police officer, provided her with reassurance and support. She was a woman, torn between her empathy for the victim and her feelings towards her husband.
She was in love with this man. I think it was difficult for Sharon to accept the fact that the victim had been a mother of 3 young children. She herself was a mother of 3 children, and very much related to the victim.
Slowly, Sharon Powers worked through her internal conflict. She began to open up, revealing what her home life was like with her husband, Gerald Lee Powers. She said he ruled the house. Her 3 kids from previous marriages were afraid of him. Sharon admitted that she was too. He kept a bell on his chair. When he rang it, Sharon came running. Despite his controlling temper, her feelings for him were deep.
This is a woman who had really kind of lived under the thumb of Gerald Lee Powers for a number of years. I believe by then they had been married 4 or 5 years. And she, I don't want to say liked it that way, but that was what she was used to. That was familiar. It was not familiar to her to be breaking with him, to be disloyal.
Despite her fear, Sharon continued to open up to investigators. On April 19th, the day Shannon Sanderson was abducted, Gerald came home acting nervous.
Said shut up and sit down.
Sharon was angry because she thought he'd spent the night with another woman.
What's on your shirt?
Don't worry about it.
She noticed blood on his shirt and a cut on his arm.
Blood.
He claimed he'd fallen down at a casino he'd been visiting.
Do you remember what color the shirt was?
Sharon didn't believe what he told her, but she didn't press it. For now, Sharon refused to say any more, and neither would her husband. Without something stronger, prosecutor Jerry Kitchen would be unable to press charges on Gerald Lee Powers.
We still didn't have anything concrete that he had been involved in. It was just instinct, I think, that was leading us at this point that he was our man, but at the time we did not have the results back from the lab.
Investigators hoped the FBI would reinforce their hunch that Gerald Lee Powers was responsible for leaving Shannon Sanderson's children motherless. In the summer of 1996, after Gerald Lee Powers was indicted for assaulting a Border Patrol officer in Texas, the FBI and Memphis investigators suspected he was also responsible for the murder of a 25-year-old mother of 3. But lacking physical evidence, Memphis prosecutor Jerry Kitchen was unable to charge Powers for his involvement, or to know for certain if one of the victim's former lovers had hired him to commit the crime.
There was always that possibility. The way she was killed and the manner in which she was abducted, that it appeared like it wasn't just something random, that it had been something planned. All the other suspects that appeared to have a motive or possibly emotional reasons why someone would want to have someone killed, like jealousy or rage or other factors.
What river?
Investigators hoped the suspect's wife, Sharon Powers, could tell them more. Though reluctant at first, after many meetings over several weeks, Sharon grew more comfortable. She finally opened up to FBI Special Agent Jennifer Aiken.
When she finally told the story in its entirety, what we heard was really a chilling tale of his stalking of the victim and the abduction of the victim, and then taking her to this rural area and robbing her of not only the $5,000 that she had won that night, but also of the jewelry that she was wearing.
Sharon's story was strong, but without corroborating evidence, it would not be enough to convict or even indict Gerald Lee Powers for murder. Trying to help, she told investigators that her husband had thrown the murder weapon, a handgun, into an abandoned canal near the casino in Mississippi. Memphis Police Captain Richard Rolson accompanied local divers to help search for the handgun.
Sheriff's Department's divers dove into this hole and crawled inch by inch searching for this pistol. We never did locate it. And then that's when Miss Powers told us that he had thrown it into the river, which was about 100 yards away. The current at that location was too swift for anybody to dive in the Mississippi River.
It left investigators with more doubt and no corroboration that Sharon Powers was telling them the truth. The suspect's wife also told them about a school bus driver from Mississippi whom her husband believed had seen him close to where he dumped Shannon's body.
Did you happen to notice the driver for us?
No, I didn't notice.
Police tracked down the driver who confirmed Sharon's story. At 7 a.m., about 2 hours after Shannon Sanderson had been abducted, the driver noticed a maroon Chevy Beretta backing down the dirt roadway of the vacant property where the victim's body was later found. The bus driver remembered it because the property had been vacant for so long.
Okay, that's what we need to know.
But the driver didn't see who was in the car and didn't get the license plate.
But I did notice the car.
Searching for further corroboration, investigators turned to Tom Scott, director of surveillance at the casino. This time, Sharon Powers provided them locations of where to look for her husband in the 95,000 square foot casino.
We did a recreation and did a walkthrough on where, if we were the suspect, where we would have gone through certain areas. And we pulled some tapes. Eventually, we were able to identify just from his shoes in a particular location where the suspect was standing. We pulled a bunch more shots, connected the shoes. We finally put some legs to the shoes. And we're able to identify a person in a distant shot walking through the casino from the upstairs looking down towards the suspect. We then connected more shots and followed the suspect down an escalator, walking past the table where the victim was playing, and followed the suspect out through our front door on videotape.
The video was compelling and confirmed Gerald Lee Powers was in the casino that night, but it didn't prove that he had abducted or murdered Shannon Sanderson. Hoping for physical evidence that would connect Powers to the victim, investigators searched behind a tavern in Mississippi where Powers' wife claimed he had buried the victim's jewelry. The suspect had told her they were wrapped in tinfoil under a couch in the back. Just as Mrs. Powers described, investigators located a small bundle of foil. Inside, they found pink plastic wrap holding rings identified by the victim's husband as belonging to Shannon. Now they needed to prove forensically that Gerald Lee Powers had in fact been the one who wrapped them. Investigators went to Powers' home to search for the source of that plastic. In the kitchen, they found a roll of pink wrap. They forwarded the roll along with the bundled rings to the lab for comparison. While they waited for the results, investigators turned their attention to the pink artificial nail found inside Powers' car after he was arrested in Texas. From autopsy photos, investigators found at least 2 nails were missing from the victim's hand. If the nail from the car matched those remaining on the victim's hand, it would prove that Shannon had been in Powers' car that night. But there was a problem. Shannon had already been buried, and her husband was against exhuming her remains.
She had already been interred, and so we had a hearing in court to have her disinterred and to have the ability to examine these fingernails to see if they were in fact her fingernails or not.
Against her husband's wishes, the judge ordered the body exhumed. In early July, 3 months after the murder, investigators retrieved the body of Shannon Sanderson. Her remaining artificial nails were removed and sent to the lab for comparison with the others. The results were negative. The nail in the car wasn't hers. Investigators hoped the other evidence at the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. would provide more promising results. Inside the tinfoil ball recovered in Mississippi, examiners removed the pink plastic wrap wound tightly around some rings. The FBI needed to connect the rings physically to Gerald Lee Powers. To do so, examiners compared the plastic they were wrapped in to the sample retrieved from Powers' home.
The FBI agent who examined it indicated that it wasn't the exact piece that was torn off, but that it matched that roll exactly as far as the polymers and the dye and all that, which showed that this was the source that the material had come from that was wrapped around the rings.
It was the first piece of forensic evidence linking Powers to the victim. But the case was by no means complete. More compelling proof came from a single fiber among several found in Powers' otherwise immaculate car.
We have dress fiber that was found in the vehicle that he was driving that night that matches the fiber from the dress that the victim was wearing. And that was very significant as well.
Authorities were convinced that Gerald Lee Powers had murdered Shannon Sanderson, but they weren't convinced he'd acted alone. They believed it was possible that others from her past could claim a motive for wanting Shannon dead. Memphis prosecutor Jerry Kitchen decided to confirm it with Powers himself.
So we went to Laredo to interview the defendant before we charged him with this murder. And there was the possibility, if he cooperated and was able to prove to us that someone else was involved, that we would withdraw seeking the death penalty. But there was nothing that he was able to provide us with, so we were convinced then at that point that no one else had been involved in her abduction and murder, and proceeded with charging him alone.
Powers had plenty of time to contemplate this murder. He watched her for several hours in the casino, then followed her for another hour back to Memphis. He had ample time to change his mind. Instead, he hardened his resolve.
Get out of there!
He abducted a mother of 3, robbed her, then shot her at point blank.
Get in there.
The criminal court in Tennessee didn't need much time to decide Powers' fate. After deliberating only 15 minutes, the jury recommended death for the murder of Shannon Sanderson. Gerald Lee Powers awaits execution at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Tennessee. 13-year-old Amy McNeil had her whole life ahead of her. But when she was kidnapped on her way to school, her future was in peril. The first call her terrified parents made was to the FBI. They hoped that the combined experience of agents and local law enforcement would flesh out the kidnappers before they took her life.
Wealth has its rewards, but it also brings its dangers. Kidnapping is one of them. No ordeal is more horrifying for a family than to have a child taken. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Kidnapping cases are among the most challenging for law enforcement, who often must remain out of sight, yet close at hand, ready to move in at a moment's notice.
About 20 miles south of Fort Worth, Texas, lies Alvarado, a small town in rural Johnson County. A few wealthy residents found Alvarado a safe haven away from the state's urban centers. The McNeils were among them. They lived as one of the area's most prominent families, partly from the return that Mr. McNeil made by selling an early design of the handheld calculator. At 7:15 a.m. on Friday, January 11th, 1985, they began their day having breakfast together, as was their usual routine.
Amy!
Afterwards, their teenage son would drive himself and his 13-year-old sister, Amy, to school.
Bye, darling. Please be careful out there today. Come on, come on, come on. Bye, Amy.
On the way, Amy and her brothers stopped to pick up their cousin as well. He and his family lived in a separate house on the McNeil estate. At about 7:45, they were finally on their way to class. Then, from behind an abandoned truck, a sedan pulled out across the road, forcing the teenagers' Jeep off to the side. A gunman jumped out of the car and approached the Jeep. He demanded that Amy get into the sedan. The blonde-haired man warned her brother not to contact the authorities. He would call the family in a short while with his demands. Instinctively, the teenager started to get out to help his sister.
Leave and go home, boy!
But the kidnappers threatened to kill him and his sister if he tried to follow them. As they raced off with the 13-year-old, The teenagers couldn't make out the license plate. In a matter of seconds, the girl was gone. They turned around and sped home. The boys told the McNeils what had happened and repeated the kidnapper's warning not to contact the authorities.
They pulled us over and they had guns. And if you told the police that they kill her.
Mr. McNeil ignored the demand and called the FBI field office in nearby Fort Worth.
Give me the FBI.
Former FBI Special Agent Clint Brown, a 30-year veteran, understood that when a kidnapping occurs, every second counts.
Hello, this is Clint Brown. I worked many kidnapping cases, and in not a single case did the subject get away with it. The number one goal in all cases like this is the safe return of the victim. All activities, all actions are all geared toward not doing anything to endanger the safety of the person who's been kidnapped.
The FBI's first task was to set up a recorder on the family's phone. By capturing the kidnapper's voice, they hoped to identify him or the place he was calling from. The FBI also informed the local phone company to be prepared to trace any incoming calls. Agents instructed the father on how to handle the call. He needed to insist on proof from the kidnappers that his daughter was still alive.
Expect a call to come in today.
So you probably want to look for a
The fact that they had worn no disguises disturbed former Johnson County Sheriff Eddie Boggs, who called in the Texas Rangers moments after he arrived.
The kidnappers hadn't tried to conceal who they were at all. They just, as we call it, they just barefaced them, just no mask, no disguises, anything. That means there's not going to be a victim around telling who they are, what they look like. They're going to kill them.
Uncovering the kidnappers' identities might prevent that. Using an identikit that included hundreds of facial features, investigators worked with Amy's brother and cousin, building a composite of the man who held the shotgun. The teenagers had never seen the man with the stringy blonde hair before. They also provided a description of the kidnapper's car.
It seems like the people who engage in this are people of questionable and limited mental capacity, and very often they have, I guess what you might say, delusions based on drug use. Very often, you know, the need to get money to promote their drug habits or what drives them, and so we have that being a motive for the kidnappings very much, and that certainly impairs their ability to think or plan or pull this off successfully.
At 10 a.m., over 2 hours after Amy had been abducted, the phone finally rang.
Hello?
It was one of her kidnappers.
Yeah?
Did your son tell you I had your daughter?
The man demanded a $100,000 ransom.
Yeah?
Half was to be in $100 bills, the other half in smaller denominations. None of it could be sequenced. As instructed, Amy's father pleaded to speak to his daughter, but the kidnapper refused. Her captor insisted Amy was still alive and that her father could speak to her. When the man called back to say where to drop the ransom, he added that if the family called the FBI, they would never see Amy again. The call lasted less than a minute, not long enough to establish a trace for the technology of 1985. Agents played back the recording, listening for any background noise that might reveal the location. They figured the call was likely made from a payphone since they could hear wind and traffic noise. But they heard nothing more specific.
Yes, sir.
And no one in the family recognized the kidnapper's voice. Though Amy's family was wealthy, her father did not have $100,000 in cash available since most of his assets were tied up in investments. He called his associates to fly in on chartered planes with whatever cash they were able to withdraw. The next call they received was not the one retired Sheriff Eddie Boggs had hoped for. The press had learned of the kidnapping from one of McNeil's neighbors.
I got a call from my chief deputy, and he said that he has all sorts of media representatives out there wanting a story. They knew that there had been a kidnapping, there had been a ransom demand. They demanded to talk to somebody about the story and that they were going to go on the air with it.
If the kidnappers discovered that law enforcement was involved, they would likely dispose of Amy before the ransom was delivered. Investigators discussed what they should do next as precious minutes ticked by. The FBI instructed the family and the Johnson County Sheriff on how to proceed.
And the FBI said, well, here's what you do. You have your chief deputy call each one of the reporters in, ask him for his ID, ask him who is the very top man at his station that he can talk to, and then tell that top man, we're not going to confirm whether or not you have a story, but if you do have a story and you run it, you could possibly cost the life of a little girl.
Every local press agency agreed not to run the story until notified by the sheriff. Just before 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the phone rang again.
Hello? Yeah, I'm the guy who got your daughter.
It was the same man who had called earlier. On a separate line, an agent contacted the chief of security at the local phone company, who was standing by, hoping to trace the call.
Yeah.
He trapped the number and began to track its origin.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mr. McNeil begged the kidnapper to let him hear his daughter's voice.
Calm down.
This time, the man allowed the frightened girl to speak to her father.
Daddy?
Her eyes concealed to prevent her from knowing where she was.
You haven't hurt me.
Be my girl.
He could hear her crying. Despite his own fear, he reassured Amy that everything would be okay and that she would soon be home. That's when the man grabbed the phone. The kidnapper said that he had not yet secured a location for the ransom to be dropped.
What do you mean you're having trouble getting a drop zone?
Again, he promised to call back later.
Hello?
The room fell silent as former Texas Ranger Bill Gunn recalls.
It was very heartrending to listen to it. She was frightened, and of course Mr. McNeil was frightened. The conversation was very short. Mr. McNeil encouraged her to keep her upper lip up and remember who she was. And that was the end of the conversation.
They hoped the trace would be successful.
That's the hardest part, correct?
The security chief reported that the call had originated from outside the phone company's calling area. And since the call had been terminated, it would be impossible to trace it through the neighboring system. The phone company was able to determine that the call was made from somewhere in the town of Kennedale, 25 miles north of the McNeil's estate.
Good.
Amy was still in Texas, close to Fort Worth.
Kennedale? Okay, sounds like.
But without a specific location, investigators had little to go on.
You know she's in Texas. Yeah.
We had no idea, no evidence, no leads, nowhere to go. The only thing we had was the description of a car. I did have my troops, what few I had, to go out and start in a perimeter and expanding the perimeter, checking every farm, every house, every housing addition, everywhere they could for a car that matched the description that we had.
Johnson County deputies fanned out over a 30-mile radius from Alvarado up to Kennedale, searching for the kidnapper's car. They also alerted other local officers to be on the lookout for the four-door sedan. Yet without a license plate, it was not likely they'd locate the vehicle among the rural expanse. Almost 6 hours after 13-year-old Amy McNeil had been abducted, her father's friends from Texas and Arkansas had begun to arrive in Alvarado, carrying tens of thousands in cash. Texas Rangers escorted them from a small airport to a local bank where the currency would be processed before it was paid to the kidnappers. Wearing latex gloves, Rangers recorded and bundled the $100,000 ransom. They assembled half of it in $100 bills as the kidnapper had instructed. Another $50,000 was compiled from smaller denominations. Retired Texas Ranger Sergeant John Dendy helped direct the processing.
They had quite a time raising that amount of money on such short notice. But after they got the money, then the Rangers that were at the bank started to getting clean bags to put it in. In other words, no fingerprints, plastic bags, and made copies of the bills, so we'd have the serial numbers on each bill. Everything was loaded up, and then all we had to do then was sit and wait until more demands came in.
In the late afternoon, deputies had located a car that fit the description of the kidnapper's vehicle, parked 20 miles from the McNeil's estate. A license plate check revealed that the sedan had been stolen the day before from Mesquite, Texas, 50 miles east of Alvarado. Inside, deputies found no obvious signs of Amy or her abductors. They impounded the car and continued to canvass the area for witnesses who may have seen the driver. At the Johnson County Sheriff's Department, the FBI processed the sedan for forensic evidence. From the interior, they removed several sets of fingerprints. But without a suspect's prints to compare them to, the recovered prints could not help identify Amy's captors or their current whereabouts. By 11:30 p.m., 16 hours after Amy had been taken, her family had received 3 more phone calls, but still had not been told where the ransom was to be dropped. They hoped this would be the call that could secure Amy's release.
Hello?
It was the same man who had called earlier.
Yeah?
Once again, the phone company initiated a trace.
Yeah, I'm working on it right now.
Amy's father told the kidnapper that he had the $100,000 prepared as the man had requested.
No, I don't want to do this tomorrow.
But the caller said that it was too late. The ransom
the
drop he had in mind was at least 200 miles away from Alvarado.
There's the gas station. No.
By the time Mr. McNeil reached the location, it would be light, too risky for the kidnapper to take a chance on being seen.
No, I don't.
The father pleaded to make the exchange tonight.
No, I can't wait till tomorrow.
The man refused. He said he'd call back tomorrow to make the arrangements.
We didn't think they would let us have her back alive, you know, in good shape. We had no idea what they'd done to her in this period of time that they'd had her.
Agents waited for word to see if the trace had been successful.
Yeah. No, it wasn't long enough.
It had not.
No. Couldn't get a trace.
Once again, the phone company had failed to secure the kidnapper's location.
All right, thanks.
Investigators could only hope that 13-year-old Amy McNeil would survive the night and eventually be reunited with her parents. By 5 p.m. on Saturday, January 12, 1985, a day and a half had passed since 13-year-old Amy McNeil had been kidnapped on her way to school in Alvarado, Texas. One of several unidentified kidnappers had called Amy's wealthy family 7 times. He demanded $100,000 in unsequenced currency, but had not told the McNeils where to drop the ransom. Though the kidnapper had also warned Amy's family not to call the FBI, Mr. McNeil had done so and was joined by several agents, a dozen Texas Rangers, and the Johnson County Sheriff's Department. Her abductors had promised to call again at 5 p.m. with the location of the ransom exchange and to confirm that Amy remained unharmed. Despite the agonizing wait, former Special Agent Clint Brown and his team wasted no time in preparing.
When the instructions were anticipated, a plan was devised to deliver the ransom money with Mr. McNeil driving the car and carrying the money himself for delivery so that anybody would see the car. It was the limousine that he had. They would assume he was in the car by himself. Actually concealed in the car would be 2 FBI agents.
The agents also outfitted Mr. McNeil with a mini cassette device to record any conversations he may have with the kidnappers if they should approach his limousine. The interior of the car would be wired as well, and the 2 concealed agents would be heavily armed. At 5:10 p.m., the kidnapper called again. He told Mr. McNeil to drive 40 miles alone in his limousine from Alvarado on Interstate 30 to East Dallas and take exit 51. There he would find a gas station. The father was to be there by 7 p.m. in order to receive further instructions on the payphone by the vending machine. Mr. McNeil spoke to Amy briefly before her abductor disconnected. She was scared, but unharmed. The call was too brief to be traced. As planned, a contingent of FBI, Texas Rangers, and Johnson County personnel would follow McNeil's car at a distance. The team would be fully equipped, as retired Texas Ranger Bill Gunn remembers.
We got all of the assets available, tracking devices, aircraft. We had a tracking device on Mr. McNeil's car so that if we lost contact with it on the ground, both aircraft could receive it.
Amy's father promised his wife that he wouldn't come home without their daughter. He was fitted with body armor and provided with a sidearm in the event the kidnappers attacked him. The 2 agents with him would be armed with shotguns and semi-automatic pistols. They checked their radios to make sure they could be heard by the follow team.
You guys okay back there? Check 1, check 2.
Retired FBI Special Agent Rod Kicklighter was assigned to ride in the limousine and advise the concerned father.
I recall one of our main instructions to him was not to let himself be taken hostage. And we talked through that quite a bit. He was to deliver the money, and we would then take over, try to effect the arrest, but he was in no way to get involved himself.
McNeil got the go-ahead to leave for the gas station in East Dallas, 40 miles away. When the limo had reached about a mile, the agent instructed the others to follow. Since the kidnapper had provided a specific route to the Dallas gas station, former Ranger Sergeant John Dendy and the others feared that the kidnappers could be surveilling the limousine as it traveled.
We had no idea where they would be, who they were, what they were in, or anything about them. And in order for them not to become suspicious of any of us, we kept a good distance behind the car.
As the stretch crossed county lines, the Rangers radioed ahead to local authorities. They informed traffic patrols not to stop the speeding unmarked cars and provided license plates for their vehicles. Several units raced ahead to set up surveillance of the service station in East Dallas. While most maintained an outside perimeter, one team held a distant view of the payphone. They stood by, ready to act, in the event that the kidnappers revealed themselves or their 13-year-old hostage. Agents reported that the limousine had just reached exit 51. The phone had begun ringing at exactly 7 p.m. when Amy's father rolled into the service station.
What? Okay, hold on.
It was the 8th call he had received from his daughter's kidnappers over the past 34 hours. the man did not give the father the news he had hoped for. He told Mr. McNeil to take Interstate 20 east to Tyler, Texas, almost 100 miles from Dallas. At the US 69 exit, he would find another gas station, where he'd receive another call at 9:20 on the payphone outside. For retired Special Agent Clint Brown, it was difficult to predict what Amy's abductors might be planning.
We could tell the kidnappers were not very well organized. They seemed somewhat ill at ease, confused. Some of their plans seemed to change. They didn't seem to have a clear idea of where the money was to be delivered, and so they even appeared to be stalling at times, trying to formulate a workable plan that they thought they could use. So it did not appear that they had thought this out very well at all.
At the second gas station in Tyler, Amy's father was directed to drive to a third one in Longview, 40 miles further east, by 11 p.m. From there, he was ordered to drive 60 more miles north to a fourth gas station in Mount Pleasant, Texas. Precisely at midnight, he'd receive another call at the payphone outside. By now, investigators had covered over 180 miles, traveling for well over 5.5 hours. They hadn't anticipated the long trip, and 2 surveillance aircraft were forced to turn back to refuel in Dallas. Despite their frustrations, the team was determined to outlast the kidnappers.
We had no idea what they were going to do next. They just kept running us over East Texas. We saw a large portion of East Texas, and we didn't know when it was going to stop. But we knew that we were there for the duration.
But the situation was only getting worse. About halfway to the Mount Pleasant gas station, the limousine began losing power. After racing at speeds in excess of 100 miles an hour for extended periods, the engine simply quit. Agent Kicklighter feared that the mechanical problem would jeopardize any chance they may have still had to rescue the 13-year-old.
We're all getting a little tense and excited and worried that we're not going to get to the drop site and that we're not going to be able to get Amy back.
Dozens of miles away, at the gas station in Mount Pleasant, 2 camouflaged Texas Ranger snipers had been deployed to surveil the payphone. At midnight, it began to ring. Mr. McNeil was the only one who could answer. But he missed the call. At midnight on January 13th, 1985, just outside Mount Pleasant, Texas, 2 FBI agents and the wealthy father of a kidnapped 13-year-old girl worked frantically to repair a limousine's engine. Mr. McNeil's limousine was the car his daughter's kidnappers expected him to be driving alone to a Mount Pleasant gas station payphone by midnight. As Mr. McNeil tried to restart his car, 2 camouflaged Texas Ranger snipers, deployed to surveil the gas station, watched helplessly as the phone began ringing. Mr. McNeil was the only one who could answer, but he missed the call for the final location of the $100,000 ransom exchange. Patrolling the desolate roads around the gas station in Mount Pleasant, the support team was informed that Mr. McNeil had finally found his car's difficulty, according to former FBI Special Agent Clint Brown.
The car that Mr. McNeil was riding in began to develop electrical problems. Apparently the alternator wasn't keeping the battery charged up, and so as time went on, the lights began to dim and he began to have trouble with the electrical system of the car.
The communications and tracking devices wired to the limo system had drained its power over the past 7 hours. Disconnecting several instruments provided enough juice to get the engine started again. Though the headlights were inoperable, the car would move forward. Mr. McNeil and the two agents pressed on without full power and limited visibility. Their path was lit by an aircraft overhead. The remaining FBI agents, Texas Rangers, and Johnson County personnel gathered at a separate filling station a short distance from where the kidnappers had planned to call. They debated what to do next, since Mr. McNeil had missed the midnight appointment, and they had no way of contacting the kidnappers. With few options, investigators decided to send the limousine to the Mount Pleasant gas station late, figuring that the kidnappers would probably call again.
We were pretty well counting on the fact that they were going to show up or call, that they were desperate for the money. We reassured them we had the money, and we certainly reassured them we wanted Amy back. So we thought that they would stay connected to follow through with a payoff site.
At approximately 1 a.m., Mr. McNeil and the FBI agents arrived at the Mount Pleasant gas station in the troubled limousine. Almost 8 hours and 200 miles after they had first departed Alvarado, the limousine's engine gave out for good. The vehicle wasn't going anywhere without major repair. They could do nothing more but wait in the chilly night and pray that the kidnappers would contact them.
Due to the fact that we had to drive very slowly in the limousine, we were late getting to the drop site, approximately an hour. We were somewhat concerned about that, but we set up to wait by the drop site.
Texas Rangers kept watch, remaining hidden in the field across from the gas station. The fate of 13-year-old Amy McNeil remained unknown. Then, at 1:15 in the morning, the payphone started ringing. As investigators had suspected, one of the kidnappers called back, eager to get the ransom. He claimed that Amy was still alive, but refused to let her speak. Worst still, former Texas Ranger Bill Gunn and his team learned that the assailants had likely spotted the heavy presence of law enforcement on the desolate roads.
They started out telling him that he had brought the police with him, and they were very unhappy with that. So they finally told him to bring the money to a motel in Mount Pleasant. And at that time, he informed the man, the kidnapper, that he could not move the vehicle again. It was dead. And the man told him on the phone then, they said, well, we're coming after the money, and we've got plenty of guns, and there better not be any police officers around.
The father remained resolute, despite his fear of what the kidnappers may have already done to his daughter. He grabbed the ransom bag and stood outside so his daughter's captors could see him as they approached. Agents hidden in the limousine readied themselves for an armed confrontation. Retired Special Agent Kicklighter realized a mistake now could cost lives.
The exchange of a ransom during a kidnapping is always one of the most critical elements of the investigation. In this case, you don't want someone else to be hurt or taken hostage and be another victim of a kidnapping.
Hours passed in the cold January night. The Rangers stayed alert, protecting against an ambush. On the road circling the gas station, investigators saw no sign of vehicles approaching the ransom drop.
See anything out here?
By 3 in the morning, 2 hours after the kidnappers had called, it looked as if they weren't going to show. The Texas Rangers, Johnson County deputies, and the FBI considered what their next move should be.
It was decided that they were not going to come, and so the whole surveillance and monitoring situation was called off in anticipation we're going to have to start again the next day on Sunday.
Agents in the limo received word of the decision to regroup until daybreak. Mr. McNeil insisted they stay. But investigators convinced him that at present, there was nothing more they could do for his daughter.
Money, if nothing else, right?
Mr. McNeil was upset that yet another night was going to pass without a resolution to getting his daughter back. He had done everything that they had told him to do, so there was a great deal of disappointment.
A car came by to pick up McNeil and the agents. They headed back to the nearby gas station where others had begun to assemble. The two rangers, hiding in the field for the past 3 hours, moved toward the street where the sheriff was to meet them in a separate van. As they approached, an unidentified vehicle cruised by their position. It was filled with a group of men and a young girl who headed towards the interstate.
Buick southbound.
The Rangers called for units.
Location. Need somebody to pick them up.
As they watched those believed to be the kidnappers speed off into the cold Texas night. At 3:45 a.m. on January 13th, 1985, 2 Texas Rangers believed they had spotted the kidnappers of 13-year-old Amy McNeil racing away from the Ransom drop point in Mount Pleasant, Texas.
Copy me, command post, copy.
They alerted all available units in the area.
High rate of speed,
En route to collect the Rangers, the Johnson County Sheriff heard their call and saw the suspicious vehicle on the highway. He gave chase, but the sedan easily pulled away from the lumbering van that former Sheriff Eddie Boggs was driving.
My van being as slow as it was, they outran me like I was standing still. There wasn't any way I could keep up even within sight of what was going on, because that chase was going over 100 miles an hour, and it was unbelievable.
Despite his best efforts, the sheriff lost the car and returned to the makeshift command post to provide a detailed account. Amy's life was now in even greater jeopardy since there was no question the kidnappers knew law enforcement was in the area. Then a call came in from their remaining aircraft. The pilot had spotted the vehicle, and investigators still on the road had resumed the chase. Former Texas Ranger Bill Gunn recalls that the suspects were speeding west on Interstate 30.
But at that time, the rest of us had gotten involved, and we were in pursuit of the vehicle. And we continued at a high-speed chase down Interstate 30, which would have been a direction going toward Dallas, and to a small community in another county.
10 minutes later, Texas Rangers, sheriff deputies, and the FBI fell into line. The suspects refused to slow down. As the lead ranger began to close in, he was fired upon. A shotgun and pistol pelted his car with rounds. As he prepared to return fire, he glimpsed 2 girls in the back seat. One was young Amy McNeil, who they were forcing into the back window.
The people who were responsible for this started firing guns at them out the back windows on each side of the Buick. They would push Amy up into the back glass where she could be seen, and of course we couldn't return any fire.
Construction narrowed the interstate to 1 lane, but the suspects did not slow. Shots hit the grill of the lead car. Slugs pierced the carburetor, forcing the Ranger to stop. The chase continued at high speeds through 3 Texas counties before the suspects exited into the small town of Saltillo, Texas.
Dispatch, looks like we're slowing down.
Unexpectedly, at about 4 a.m., they stopped on the front lawn of a home and several fled on foot. They opened fire on investigators. 2 gunmen barricaded themselves behind a van parked in the driveway. while a third disappeared behind the house. None of the officers on the scene were wearing body armor.
When I first got out of the car, I could see this man standing in front of the van. Now, this is Sunday morning at 4 o'clock, and no moon as far as I can remember. And every time he'd pull off around with that 12 gauge, he'd light up the world.
Investigators took cover behind their vehicles and pinned the gunman down. The suspect's abandoned car was in the direct line of fire. Amy was trapped inside without any means of escape. One assailant attempted to break into the home of an elderly resident. She took cover, not knowing what was happening a few feet from where she had slept. As the firefight raged on, investigators knew that they had to somehow get to Amy McNeil before it was too late. At 4 a.m. on January 13th, 1985, the FBI, Texas Rangers, and Johnson County sheriffs exchanged gunfire with the kidnappers of 13-year-old Amy McNeil. After being held for almost 2 days, Amy remained trapped inside her captor's vehicle with a female assailant on the front lawn of a farmhouse in Saltillo, Texas. Ranger Sergeant John Dendy was one of several who braved the hail of bullets.
I could see one of them behind the front wheel of the car, and that's what I was mainly shooting at. I didn't have any other place to go. And the only thing I knew to do is shut them down. And the only way I'm going to do that is to hit one of them.
Several miles away in another vehicle, Amy's wealthy father was accompanied by the Johnson County Sheriff and an FBI agent on their way to the scene. They could do nothing more but hope and pray that the 13-year-old would survive the battle.
Locally here, go ahead.
As the shooting continued, a Johnson County Sheriff's deputy moved towards the suspect's car, as Ranger Bill Gunn recalls.
One deputy sheriff ran from the vehicle that he arrived in over to the kidnapper's vehicle, and she asked him if he was a police officer, and he said, "Yes, ma'am," and she just really grabbed hold of him then and hung on.
The deputy handed the frightened girl to a ranger who took her out of harm's way. They ran back to the road where more backup arrived. After 44 hours in captivity, 13-year-old Amy McNeil was finally safe. The ranger needed to contact the other investigators and to tell her father the good news. Retired FBI Special Agent Rod Kicklighter was in the vehicle as the ranger's call came through.
It seemed like hours before we finally got the confirmation that Amy was safe. I recall Mr. McNeil beating me about the head and shoulders about Amy being safe and they've got her, and he was ecstatic, as were we all.
Hold your fire! Hold your fire!
While Amy was headed to meet her father, the shooting had subsided. The gunmen had both been wounded. Investigators held their weapons on them, not sure if the suspect still had ammunition. Then, out of the shadows, a third gunman emerged.
Freeze! Get out! Get on your knees! Get on your knees! Drop your weapon!
Realizing that escape was impossible, he surrendered. From inside the kidnapper's car, investigators cuffed the female suspect and a fourth man who had remained there during the shootout. Rangers confirmed with Amy that all the kidnappers were now in custody. On a deserted highway a mile away, Amy ran towards the waiting van that held Mr. McNeil.
Dad! Dad!
Former Special Agent Clint Brown watched the reunion between father and daughter.
Everybody was pretty emotional. You know, we all had kids and daughters and such, so we were pretty emotional just watching that reunion, and everyone was so happy that it had turned out so well that we all shared in that excitement and joy of her being recovered safely.
No one but the suspects had been hit by gunfire. Both were ex-convicts and high on methamphetamine at the time of the shooting. The elderly resident was also examined. She had survived the ordeal with only frayed nerves. A license plate check on the kidnapper's car revealed that it had been stolen in Dallas the day before. Investigators also figured out why the suspects had stopped their vehicle when they had.
We never could understand why they turned in at this particular house. But we found out later they'd run out of gasoline.
34-year-old James Foote, who had made the initial ransom calls, had previously worked for Mr. McNeil and had hatched the plan to kidnap Amy. For using a weapon in the commission of the crime, he was convicted of aggravated kidnapping and attempted murder and was sentenced to life in prison. 27-year-old Michael Mills, who had made the remaining calls, was likewise convicted of aggravated kidnapping and attempted murder, receiving life. The other assailants, 21-year-old Daniel Neckar Jr. and 21-year-old Thomas Barnes, were convicted of the same charges and also sentenced to life. The 18-year-old woman who was with them was charged as the men were. She had only met James Foote a few days earlier before the kidnapping had occurred. The woman was scared when the men brought the 13-year-old into the house, but stayed to prevent Amy from being abused by them. Amy later confirmed that the 18-year-old had protected her, according to retired Johnson County Sheriff Eddie Boggs.
She was only given a 10-year probated sentence per Amy's request. The female accomplice really didn't know what she was getting into at the time whenever she joined them, because they had already been using dope for several days steady before she got involved in it. And it was just she got involved in something she couldn't get out of.
6 months later, on July 4th, 1985, Foote was transferred from the state penitentiary to the Johnson County Jail to face additional charges. Authorities had traced the weapons he used in the kidnapping to the armed home invasion of a Dallas man. Foote was also indicted in Arlington, where he had attempted to kidnap the child of a wealthy developer days before he took Amy. Outside, in the blistering Texas summer, the prison guard agreed to retrieve a water hose to cool down the inmates. When he left, Foote climbed over the 8-foot fence. He made it under the barbed wire. Seconds later, the kidnapper disappeared into the nearby woods. That evening, the Johnson County Sheriff faced the difficult task of informing Mr. McNeil that his daughter's kidnapper had escaped to where no one knew. Deputies would be stationed outside the McNeil home as long as Foote remained at large, fearing that the convict might seek vengeance on the family. Mr. McNeil immediately offered a reward for any information leading to Foote's recapture. A few days later, a call came in to Sheriff Boggs that seemed promising.
James Foote had a cousin that lived up close to Paris, Texas, that called in and said that he knew where he was and had been in contact with him. And that cousin also had some criminal charges pending on him and was willing to make a deal.
Okay, guys, we're going to be entering.
Foote had been hiding in the cousin's Paris, Texas home, 170 miles northwest of the prison.
Gain access to the property.
Johnson County deputies prepared for the assault of the single-story dwelling.
Over here. This is your living room area.
They readied themselves for another armed confrontation. As promised, the cousin made certain that Foote was inside at home for the arrest to take place.
Deputy Sheriff, freeze! Get your hands up, it's your
This
hands.
time, there would be no shootout. Sheriff deputies captured Foote without incident. He was returned to prison, where Foote will spend the rest of his life. At the state capitol in Austin, Texas, retired Ranger Sergeant John Dendy was among those who received commendation and recognition for the successful conclusion to the case.
Going to Austin, talking to the governor, getting a commendation. The fact that I knew that I had had something to do with saving this beautiful little girl's life was worth more than anything else they could do. That made everything worthwhile. All the 36 years that I spent in law enforcement, that was the top.
Because law enforcement responded quickly and did not relent, Amy McNeil was reunited with her family and friends, thankful for the determined officers and agents who answered the call.